he was also a man admired by everybody else in the team. Bobby was admired as a great player, one of the best defenders of all time, perhaps equal with Beckenbauer, if not the best. So completely respected for his playing ability. Much liked and much respected as a man. Much liked and much respected as a colleague, the person you want in the trenches with you, and led by example and dignity. He was the face of the England football team. Later, of course, to be of English football when he becomes the only captain to win it. There's two wonderful things about Jack Charlton, who, of course, was his twin centre-half. Jack remembers that when we were winning the World Cup with a few minutes to go, 2-1, and we gave a goal away. And Jack said that the only time he remembered Bobby Moore really telling him off so strongly as to use a swear word, that he turned around to Jack after the goal and said, "Don't ever effing do that again." And that, he said, was the only time that he recalled being sworn at. Well, industrial language in football has been with us forever. He said that was the only time. When we unveiled the statue of Bobby at Wembley Stadium, Jack was there, which was great, and what have you. And then the next time I saw him was a few weeks later, and he said, "Hey, I went back to see our Bobby, War Bobby." I said, "What was that?" He said, "The following morning," he told me. So the following morning, after we unveiled the statue, he was staying in a hotel in town in London overnight. He got the tube back out to Wembley, and he walked up to see the statue. I said, "Oh, that was nice, Jack. Why was that?" And he said, "Because we'd seen the statue unveiled." He said, "I wanted to have a chat with our kid." He said, "I wanted to tell him how much I miss him, and I wanted just to have a conversation with him. I miss him so much. I miss all the intelligence and all the brightness that he brought to our conversations." I said, "What did he say back?" He said, "We did it."
What was it like after Bobby and the team won the World Cup? What was the nation's response, and what was it like being around Bobby in public after that?
Well, he became clearly one of the major figures in Britain, one of the most celebrated people, one of the most recognised faces. Football, as a consequence of the World Cup, went from being the game for muddied oafs and as the FA committee saw them, the game for muddied oafs, an industrial game, a game for gentlemen played by louts as opposed to rugby, which was a game for the other way around. A game for louts played by gentlemen and the rest of it. And suddenly footballers like Bobby and Bobby Charlton and co suddenly became society figures, invited to the big parties, the cinema, the film premieres, great dinner parties in London. They became part of the boudoir set and so on and so forth. And it did change the perspective of footballers. And today's footballers, and I think a lot of them do, remember that this opened up the floodgates of opportunities for them in many ways down the years that followed. The footballers became very hot properties in the social world and in business life because they got a little bit more money, but people wanted to come in and attract them to support their businesses. None of them were very clever at it, unfortunately. None of them made a fortune. But the perspective of football and footballers changed. And a lot of people who rather snootily turned their nose up at football saw the reaction, and especially the reaction around the world. The media had just about got to the point where you discovered that the two most spoken words in the English language around the planet were Bobby Charlton for a while. So it changed the whole perspective of the game, and Bobby was, the handsome figurehead of all that.
Jeff, me and you have had a few nights out in our time as friends. We've been to many countries and worked alongside each other as sort of journalists and stuff. You more journalist than me, but surely you and Bobby must have had a great time and a great period after he won the World Cup, and it must have been a real magic era in your life, if you like.
Well, it was quite hysterical. I mean, not knowing him with Bobby, I was pretty friendly with a few other fairly good footballers like George Best, and we had, down the years, we had an extraordinary time. I spent a lot of time with Bobby. People like George, who was also the most beautiful human being, was extremely misunderstood at some points in his life, and countless. I recall, I think it was ITV not BBC, who wanted to do a day in the life of suddenly they wanted to do a day in the life of the football journalist, doing an England game at Wembley. So we mocked up some briefing in the office. I mean, you're going to go and cover Wembley, they're going to rely on me to make the judgments and write the pieces, and I know what time it's got to be done by. But we did the briefing, and then we got in the car and drove to Wembley, and people were hammering on the windows. So it had a spin-off effect for people like myself, and then went through. They filmed me dictate. I dictated a lot of copy, dictating the running stories, and so on and so forth. Went to the interviews afterwards, which were not in a big cold room. We're chatting to people, which was a much better way to do it. And then they said, "Oh, well, that was great." And I said, "Hold on, we haven't finished yet." And they said, "Why? What's that about?" I said, "Well, we now go out and we'll meet up with the chaps later." And they said, "What's that?" So I finished writing the rewrite about 11:30, and we went to a club called Morton's in Berkeley Square. And they said, "Why are we here?" I said, "Oh, well," and suddenly Brian Robson comes through the door, Gavin Keegan comes through the door, and one or two others. And so we have a drink, and it's now getting towards 1 o'clock and what have you. And we finish up there about 2:30, and we're standing outside on the steps. And they said, "Oh, well, thank goodness that's over." I said, "Oh, no, we haven't finished yet because we're going on to another place." And they said, What? We can't do that. We can't do that. We can't go on. All we're going to do, we want to ask you one question." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And Robbo was standing beside me, sort of laughing at them. And they said, "Well, of all the things you do, like, you write okay, and you've got contacts, and you've got some experience at big events anymore, but what's the most important thing to you in your job?" And I went, "Stamina."
Was you disappointed in the way Bobby Moore was treated after he retired from football? Is that something that you're able to talk about?
It was extremely disappointing. One way to look at it, and we've all talked about this a million times, what happened to Bobby? Why wasn't he in the game, and what have you? The best way to look at it, and I mentioned Beckenbauer before, is Bobby and Franz were very close friends. I spent some time with them together and a lot of time with them apart. Got to know Franz pretty well, not as well as Bobby, of course, down the years. We used to sometimes go to Simpson in the Strand and play chess against each other, which was the home of where chess began in England, eating our slices of meat off the trolleys. And Bobby was left here doing next to nothing. Franz was taken over by the Germans Football Federation. He went off and got some experience managing top teams, was brought back, became the only man to win the World Cup as player, captain and manager, which is exactly what should have happened to Bobby. He was a very similar character and temperament to Bobby. Bobby was perhaps seen as, perhaps sometimes as being loquacious enough, but Franz was also of that ilk. Terry Venables will tell you that he was the youngest player in this country ever to get the full coaching badge. He went and he said his impact on the young players at Crystal Palace was astonishing, and yet the game was ignoring him. Was there a move against him in certain high places? Yes, out of envy among the people who were in charge of the game at the time, without question. They saw Bobby becoming so huge that, the midgets on the FA committee were envious of all that. There's no question that happened. Was he regarded in some way of a bad light? Was there a problem, the aftermath of him being accused of stealing a bracelet in a jewellery shop in Bogata when England were there playing in Colombia en route to the 1970 World Cup finals? It shouldn't be, because clearly he did nothing. If anybody did anything, then it was going to be very unpleasant for the whole team. He took it upon himself, as he always did, as captain, to take on the responsibility of dealing with it. It involved a lot of problems with seeing off the accusation. He was under house arrest, allegedly under house arrest in Bogota. He dealt with all that, charmed everybody in Colombia, was finally, of course, released without a problem. He used to wake up in the mornings of house arrest, come downstairs, he was still keeping himself fit, because he had a little thing called the Defence of the World Cup in 1970 to deal with shortly. He would go out running, and the guards who were supposed to be keeping in the house of a very distinguished Colombian football official were sleeping on their chairs. He'd go running, and then when he came on his way back, he'd pick up a couple of bottles of milk and some cereals and give them to the guards who were supposed to be keeping him in the house as he came back in. I mean, he did all that. So there should have been no slight on Bobby's personality. But something really weird happened with regard to Watford. Hold on a second. Bobby was only getting offered the smallest jobs. But I'd got to know Elton John when Watford were doing well. Or he'd become chairman of Watford, He'd become chairman of Watford, and he became interested in the England team, and Don, he asked me if he could sort of get him a little bit closer to the England team. So I spoke with Don Revie, who was the manager. He said, yeah, of course. He said, so a couple of times I got him on the plane to go with us to away games and things like that. So we'd become fairly chatty. He invited me to a couple of his concerts. I'm home in bed at 6:30 one morning. Elton, the phone rings, it's Elton. Oh, Jeff, can you possibly get me to have a talk with Bobby Moore? So I said, yeah, I can do that. He said, I want him to be manager of Watford. So I said, well, let's talk about it. So he said, how soon can you do it? I said, well, Bobby's an insomniac. If I was to wake him when he was going to have an hour's sleep at 6 in the morning, but I'll get back to you in a day or two. So I spoke with Bobby. He said, oh, that would be really interesting, manager of Watford, better than the stuff I'm being offered. So I arranged lunch for the two of them at what was then the Howard Hotel on the embankment near Blackfriars. And we went and had lunch. It went swimmingly. Elton loved Bobby. Bobby was very interested. Meeting of stars, if you like. Thought Elton would be fine. Watford would be the step he was looking for. I left them for half an hour while they sorted out the principles of the money. I came back, and over the digestivos, we all said everything was fine. And Elton said, I'll get straight back to you. He said, well, call Jeff, whatever you want to know, and we'll get it done. 2 weeks go by, nothing happens. Bobby let it go for 3 weeks, and then we spoke. He said, what's happening with Elton? I said, I have to find out. So I called Elton and I said, what's going on? Oh, he said, a lot of people wondered about what I was doing, and then other people on the board kind of said there's this Graham Taylor at Watford, and, did Bobby have enough experience? And it was the kind of stuff you'd heard from the FA. Did Bobby have enough experience? And, was he perhaps, not outgoing enough to be a dynamic coach? The youngest man to get the full coaching badge.
And England World Cup winning captain.
A man who defended with by a computer in his brain. If nothing else, he should have been England's defensive coach. But I heard this stuff coming out of Elton, so I said, well, I think you should call him. He said, oh, no, you'll have to tell him. And that was a serious blow to Bobby, among the many elements that of the game which let him down. And his talent became a complete loss to English football we've never looked like winning the World Cup ever since, and we should discount 2018 because that was an extremely fortuitous campaign in Russia, and by virtue of the draw that we got. So we've never looked like winning it since. And Franz Beckenbauer came back to win the World Cup for Germany. They should hang their heads in shame.